Welcome to another Planning Commission training video. I'm going to cover planned unit developments, a development tool often referred to as PUDs. These are the topics I'm going to cover on this training video. This presentation was initially created for Dayton, Tennessee, a community that is currently considering adding PUD standards to their zoning ordinance. I have opted to leave in the considerations that Dayton was looking at. I think it will serve as a useful example as to what goes into the implementation of planned unit developments and establishing these regulations. So to get to the most important question for this training, what is a PUD? To put it simply, it is a development project that is considered comprehensively at one time. The American Planning Association defines a PUD as a development that has been approved in a process that requires the comprehensive review of project design and that can include a variety of development types, including infill developments, housing developments, mixed-use developments, such as master planned communities. As stated by the APA, there can be several types of developments that can be considered a PUD, and defining a PUD is more about the approval process than it is about the land use or specific design. The APA goes on to describe a PUD as both a physical plan and a legal concept. As a legal concept, a PUD gives developers flexibility within the boundaries of a PUD. This flexibility comes in the form of mixed uses, setbacks, and dimensional requirements that vary from the underlying zoning. And in contrast, a typical development applies the dimensions and density requirements uniformly throughout the entire development in the same as all the other developments within the same zoning district. As a physical plan, a PUD is the design of a neighborhood or development, typically with some residential component. These standards are a bit higher than a typical subdivision plat. An example might be requiring a landscaping plan for a PUD, but not for a typical subdivision. PUDs are not a new concept. They initially came about in the 1950s during the post-war era when residential suburbs began to grow very rapidly. PUDs were seen as a way to offer more shared open space and to have more variation in residential development. As I hinted at earlier, there are several types of PUDs that we can see throughout our region. The most common type that is implemented is called a cluster development. Sometimes these are referred to as conservation developments, with the idea that houses can be clustered together and to allow larger areas of open space to be conserved. When the open space is taken into account, the overall density of the development ends up being the same as a typically developed subdivision. This can provide the developer with the benefit of not having to build as much infrastructure such as roads and utilities for the same number of houses. A residential PUD is a broader category of PUDs. This includes mixing types of residences such as single family and multifamily in the same neighborhood. It also can offer an increased density to the surrounding development. A common requirement for these developments is to require community amenities in exchange for the increased density. Mixed-use PUDs can incorporate commercial, residential, and even public uses like schools. Commonly, there are higher density residential, such as apartments, near the commercial areas. There may also be a lower density component as well, such as a single-family residential neighborhood. The last type, but not very common in our area, is the master plan community. These communities are like their own town with commercial, residential, and public facilities included. A master plan community is typically very large, so many of our municipalities wouldn't have the type of undeveloped land needed for such a development. But these types of communities are developed, they typically utilize the PUD development process. So why would a community want to implement PUD standards? They offer significant advantages to the developer, mainly an opportunity to increase density and reduce the cost of linear infrastructure. By offering flexibility in the dimensional requirements, PUDs can create more variety in development and can be more responsive to the topography of the land. It also gives communities more oversight of large developments. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about how PUD regulations can reduce development costs and improve potentially improve housing affordability. There are three main costs to delivering a new home: the cost of the land, the cost of the infrastructure, including utilities, streets, and amenities, and of course, the construction cost of the home itself. Infrastructure costs are a cost that local governments can impact. Developers often look at the cost per foot or per mile of road, and as you can imagine, they are often trying to maximize the number of homes per mile of road that they build. Allowing smaller lots, especially narrower lots, and shorter side yard setbacks allows developers to increase the number of homes per mile of road constructed. Of course, developers do not always pass along the savings to home buyers. There have been many studies over the years on what impacts the cost of purchasing a home, and the single biggest factor tends to be supply and demand. So, while PUDs do not necessarily result in more affordable housing due to reduced development costs, they can provide an opportunity for a developer to add more homes to the housing supply than they would under standard zoning regulations. Having flexible zoning standards that PUD regulations provide can also attract certain developers to the market, since they would know that they can build at a lower price point, which may be a necessity in some of our areas that have lower income populations, since they would have a market of home buyers that could only afford a certain amount. PUD regulations do have some drawbacks, the first one being an increased cost of additional review. This cost is borne by both the city and the developer. PUDs can also result in new styles of development which could have significant community opposition. Some examples might include more mixed uses and mixed residential types, increased density, tall, skinny homes that are much more popular these days, typically 3 stories tall with a very narrow lot, or even tiny home developments. Lastly, it could be considered a drawback to have a neighborhood that is not well integrated into the surrounding area. It could disrupt a gridded street pattern, for instance, or have reduced connectivity between residential neighborhoods. PUD regulations are not the only option to allow these type of developments. Some communities have preferred to simply create new zones that allow more density and mixed uses. This allows a community to be more intentional about where they would like to see mixed use development or increased density, rather than waiting for a developer to come along and apply for a PUD. In Chattanooga, the city has utilized form-based codes as an alternative to PUDs in some areas to have more control over the design and scale of the buildings, but the code is less strict on uses permitted. Lastly, conservation design subdivisions are an option for communities that do not have zoning in place. These can be adopted within the subdivision regulations to allow homes to be clustered together in exchange for open space conservation. Here is an example of a residential PUD in our region. The farmstead is being developed in Hickson, Tennessee, in northern Hamilton County with 240 homes, and I believe future phases will add more homes. The lots are 50 feet wide and have only a 10-foot building separation. The homes range in size from 1,600 square feet to 4,000 square feet, according to their website. The homes are examples of the tall, skinny type of structure that I mentioned earlier. The developer is constructing community amenities, including a dog park, pool, clubhouse, and community plaza. The shared open space will most likely be managed by the HOA once development is fully constructed. With prices starting at $450,000, this example illustrates that PUDs do not necessarily result in more affordable housing options. This example in Chattanooga is a PUD that looks more like a conventional development. With 17-foot building separation, the homes are not much closer than the R1 zone required at the time, but the PUD designation did allow for some additional units to be built. It also resulted in a nice trail going through the neighborhood. The neighborhood provided very affordable homes starting at $150,000 back in 2008. This neighborhood had a bit of a missed opportunity, however, as it is not well connected with the surrounding neighborhoods. As is often the case, the pre-existing streets and pattern of property ownership did not allow for the streets or trails to connect. This last example could be considered a larger master planned community. It is situated on a peninsula in the Mississippi River near downtown Memphis. Built in 1989, Harbortown is a prime example of the new urbanist style of development with interconnected streets, small lots, and a mixture of housing types. There is a town center style development with grocery stores, offices, retail, and services. There are multiple small parks throughout the development. Overall, the area has held its value very well and has spurred additional high-density residential development in the area. These are some of the typical regulations included in a PUD ordinance. Some communities create a special zoning designation as a PUD, though more commonly PUDs are either overlay zones where the underlying zoning remains or permitted with a special exceptions permit. Typically, there is a minimum development size, commonly 5 or 10 acres, though in Chattanooga, some portions of the city allow a PUD as small as 2 acres. PUDs typically allow more density than the underlying zoning, but the allowed uses are often the same. I do recommend setting some minimum dimensional standards such as building separation and setbacks from the outside perimeter of the development, and some communities do have minimum lot width and side yard setbacks as well. Occasionally, I have seen where a reduced road width is permitted, though I tend to think if the city is going to take over the roads, they should meet the minimum standards as any other road would. In exchange for some of this flexibility, some communities have higher standards, such as requiring curb and gutter, sidewalks, reserved open space, and community amenities. The typical PUD approval process starts with a pre-application review with staff of the requirements, submission of what is called a concept plan or sometimes a preliminary PUD plan follows. This plan is reviewed by the Planning Commission and City Council or City Commission. Approval of this plan is approval of a special exceptions permit or, in some cases, an overlay zone. A finalized PUD site plan and preliminary subdivision plat with the engineering completed is then reviewed and approved or denied by the Planning Commission. Any substantial changes to the PUD plan often requires City Council approval after the initial preliminary approval. At this point, the process is the same as any other subdivision. After construction of the infrastructure or with a performance bond on the approved infrastructure, a final plat can be submitted and reviewed by the Planning Commission. As I said earlier, this presentation was initially for the Dayton Planning Commission to review PUDs. Currently, they do not allow PUDs, but they do have some tools that allow more diverse residential development. They allow for R3 and R4 zoned properties to have multiple principal structures. These zones allow apartments and some small office and neighborhood businesses, allowing for a mixed-use development. Without internal lot lines, these developments are much more flexible as far as setbacks and building separation goes. However, the desire for lot ownership for single-family dwellings, this does have its limitations. Many of our other communities do have similar regulations in place that offer some, but not all, the flexibility and benefits of PUDs. As I see it, allowing PUDs in Dayton and in many of our communities would allow for more housing density without having to go through a major rezoning or overhaul of the zoning ordinance. It could also create more varied neighborhoods with a mixture of housing types and commercial uses. Rather than piecemeal development, PUD regulations can facilitate and incentivize a more comprehensive planning process for a large tract of land. Here are some of the key considerations that I suggest for any community considering enacting PUD regulations. The first question relates to the approval process. Should a new zone be created or should PUDs be permitted by special exceptions? I tend to prefer this special exception permit route as it will allow for more variety of PUDs, and the special exception permit process will allow cities to add conditions to the approval when needed. The second consideration is with respect to density. Will PUDs allow overall density to be increased over existing zoning, or will density need to remain the same throughout through open space requirements? This point to an important difference between traditional cluster developments and more modern PUDs, which tend to have higher density throughout the entire development. Which direction a city takes depends on their needs. Is the infrastructure able to handle more density, or should the PUD regulations allow for more flexibility in design, but not allow for increased density in that zone? The next two questions are regarding the requirements of a PUD. Will the developer be required to preserve open space or provide community amenities? The next consideration is for road width. There are some communities that allow for narrower roads within a PUD. I tend to think that if neighborhood streets can be narrower than what the subdivision regulations require, then this standard should be extended to all developments. However, some communities see this as an incentive that allows them to require additional design features such as sidewalks and curb and gutter. Lastly, a community should consider whether the PUDs will apply to both commercial or only to residential developments. Often residential developments can be a good way to start. However, there are a lot of benefits to a mixture of uses in a PUD. Last, I just wanted to touch on some other uses where we've seen PUD regulations apply. We've seen a few build-to-rent communities in Hamilton County where all the homes are owned by the same company and managed similar to an apartment complex. It makes sense for a PUD to be utilized in this case since the management company would retain ownership of the common areas. PUDs have been used for some tiny home developments as well. Obviously, a smaller house can fit on a smaller lot, so the flexibility with dimensions is beneficial to this type of development. The same principle can apply to vacation home and developments planned for short-term vacation rentals. Our neighbors up near the Smoky Mountains are very familiar with this type of neighborhood, though we've had a few in our area as well. Lastly, there are specialty developments where it makes sense to have more flexible requirements and common amenities. We've seen a number of fly-in neighborhoods proposed in our areas for those who own airplanes, and there are a few neighborhoods with jointly owned equestrian facilities for people who own horses. And that concludes our presentation on planned unit developments. I hope this gives you some insight into your community's regulations or how the community might regulate PUDs in the future.